Hey guys, tonight we're marching straight into the muddy, blood-soaked fields of medieval warfare. Forget the shining knights, the grand chivalry, and the epic clashes you might have in your head from Hollywood movies. We're going to peel back the layers of romanticized heroism and reveal the horrifying truth about medieval warfare. It sucked. Imagine yourself standing on a battlefield, not as a valiant hero, but as someone who actually was a foot soldier or even a low-ranking knight. Sounds like a noble pursuit. Right, medieval warfare was indeed foundational to the era, but here's the cheeky reality check if you were a medieval warrior. You probably won't survive this, at least, not without constant pain, crippling fear, or wishing you had a nice, soft bed and a hot meal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first taste of the brutal reality of medieval warfare wouldn't begin on the battlefield itself, but long before. Deeply ingrained in your very upbringing, brutal training, childhood preparation, constant hardship. Forget pleasant childhoods and leisurely learning. Becoming a warrior in the Middle Ages meant a lifetime of relentless physical conditioning. Starting from an age when modern kids are still playing with toys, imagine yourself as a young boy, perhaps as young as 7 or 8 years old, sent away from your home, whether you were a noble's son destined for knighthood or a peasant boy marked for military service. Your education wouldn't be in reading or writing, but in the harsh realities of combat. This was brutal training, designed to forge resilience and skill from a tender age. For a noble's son, you might start as a page in a lord's household, running errands and learning basic etiquette. But crucially, you'd also be drilled in physical combat. Imagine yourself being taught to wield a heavy wooden sword, constantly stumbling, your small muscles aching, all before you even hit puberty. It's like joining a very intense martial arts academy, but your enrollment is mandatory for life. And the consequences of failure are dismemberment or death. This childhood preparation was unrelenting. As you grew older, progressing from page to squire around age 14, the training would intensify dramatically. You'd learn horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and lance work, often wearing progressively heavier armor to get accustomed to the weight. You'd participate in mock battles, or tourneys, which, while training, could still be incredibly dangerous and lead to serious injury. Imagine the exhaustion, the bruises, the sheer physical toll of spending your entire adolescence swinging heavy weapons and riding armored horses, day in and day out, for common soldiers. The training might be less formal, but no less demanding. Peasant levies would practice with spears, bows, or farm implements repurposed as weapons. Often taught by more experienced local lords or sergeants, their bodies were already hardened by agricultural labor, but they still faced intense physical demands when called to arms. Imagine being pulled from the fields and immediately forced into drills, your muscles protesting, knowing that your survival would soon depend on your ability to hold a shield wall or fire an arrow accurately. This was a life of constant hardship. There were no easy days, no soft comforts. Every activity, from daily chores to military drills, was designed to build strength, endurance, and a callousness to pain. Your body became a weapon, honed and hardened through relentless effort, often at the expense of other forms of personal development. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this brutal training is the detailed accounts in medieval chivalric texts and military manuals, e.g. The Book of Chivalry by Geoffroy de Charny, which outline the rigorous multi-stage training process for knights. Beginning in early childhood as pages and squires, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some noble families would reportedly send their sons to train in the households of rival lords, not just for varied experience, but also as a subtle form of hostage exchange to ensure peace between feuding families. Imagine your dad sending you off to live with his sworn enemy, just so they don't murder each other, and you're still expected to learn how to fight for both of them. It certainly added a layer of political intrigue to your already miserable childhood. Historians still argue whether this early and brutal training primarily fostered unmatched individual combat skills and a strong sense of martial prowess, contributing to the effectiveness of medieval armies, or if it simply dehumanized participants and normalized extreme violence from a young age, leading to greater brutality in warfare. Did it create elite warriors, or just numb them to suffering regardless? Your path into medieval warfare would begin with brutal training, encompassing relentless childhood preparation and a life defined by constant hardship. So, your path into medieval warfare would begin with brutal training, encompassing relentless childhood preparation and a life defined by constant hardship. But even after enduring years of physical conditioning, the actual experience of a military campaign would throw you into an even deeper level of misery. Horrible living conditions, mud, cold, constant exposure. Forget cozy barracks or comfortable tents. Medieval armies operated largely in the open, forcing you to endure the whims of nature with barely any protection. Imagine yourself on the march, part of a sprawling medieval army. You wouldn't be staying in heated hotels or even clean, organized camps. Instead, your daily existence would be defined by horrible living conditions. Much of the time, you'd be sleeping on the ground, sharing meager shelter with dozens of other soldiers. The concept of personal space was entirely alien. It's like being on the longest, least luxurious camping trip of your life. But all your fellow campers are armed and possibly covered in questionable bodily fluids. The ever-present mud was a constant torment. Medieval roads were often little more than tracks and fields. When not frozen, would quickly turn into treacherous quagmires, especially with thousands of men and horses trudging through them. Imagine trying to sleep in a damp, muddy field, your clothes caked with filth, the cold seeping into your bones. Your boots would be perpetually soaked, leading to trench foot and other agonizing conditions. Even finding a dry spot to rest would be a daily struggle. And then there was the cold. Campaigns often stretched into the colder months, or took place in northern regions where temperatures plummeted, without modern insulation or heating. Keeping warm was a constant battle. You might have a simple wool tunic and a cloak, but these offered little protection against freezing winds. Driving rain or snow. Imagine huddling with your comrades, teeth chattering, trying to find warmth from a small, smoky campfire, knowing that frostbite could steal your fingers or toes while you slept. It's enough to make you long for a simple electric blanket, or even just a very large, very warm dog to snuggle with. This meant constant exposure to the elements. You were at the mercy of the weather, whether it was scorching sun leading to dehydration and heat stroke, or torrential downpours that turned everything into a soggy mess. There were no waterproof materials, no reliable ways to dry your clothes or gear. Your body would be perpetually damp, cold, and aching. Imagine trying to maintain a keen sense of vigilance, or even just basic morale, when you're constantly shivering, soaked, and covered in grime. These conditions were not just uncomfortable, they were debilitating, weakening armies through disease and exhaustion even before a single arrow was fired. Many more soldiers succumbed to the elements than to enemy weapons. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these conditions is the numerous contemporary chronicles and military records describing the devastating impact of weather on medieval campaigns, such as the muddy conditions endured by armies during the Hundred Years' War, leading to widespread sickness and logistical nightmares. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval soldiers, in a desperate attempt to stay dry and warm, would sometimes resort to stuffing their boots and clothing with straw or dried leaves, creating makeshift insulation that was often itchy, smelly, and prone to rotting. Imagine preparing for battle by shoving hay into your trousers, only for it to get soaked and start smelling like a barn in the rain. It certainly highlights the crude nature of their comfort solutions. Historians still argue whether the extreme, horrible living conditions faced by medieval armies primarily forged an incredibly hardy and resilient soldiery, capable of enduring immense suffering, or if they simply contributed to a higher attrition rate and limited the overall effectiveness of campaigns by debilitating large portions of the fighting force. Did it make them tougher, or just sicklier regardless? Your experience as a medieval warrior would be dominated by horrible living conditions, forcing you into perpetual mud, relentless cold, and agonizing constant exposure to the brutal elements. So, your experience as a medieval warrior would be dominated by horrible living conditions, forcing you into perpetual mud, relentless cold, and agonizing constant exposure to the brutal elements. But even more pervasive than the discomfort was the ever-present, putrid stench and the terrifying reality of widespread illness, squalid hygiene disease. Lice. Unbearable stench. Forget clean hospitals and germ theory. A medieval army camp was a breeding ground for sickness, where personal cleanliness was an impossibility, and pestilence was a far more deadly foe than any sword. Imagine setting up camp after a long march. The air wouldn't be fresh and crisp. Instead, you'd be immediately assailed by an unbearable stench. This was the pervasive odor of thousands of unwashed men, uncleaned latrines if they even existed. Rather than just open ground, stale food, animal waste from horses and pack animals, and the lingering smell of unburied dead or dying comrades. Imagine trying to eat your meager rations with the overpowering smell of human and animal filth clinging to everything, making every breath a challenge. It's like living in a giant, open-air sewage farm that occasionally moves. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. Leading to squalid hygiene? Fresh water was often scarce and prioritized for drinking. Not washing. Bathing was infrequent, if it happened at all. Clothes were rarely changed or cleaned, accumulating dirt, sweat, and grime over weeks or months. Imagine going for weeks on end without a proper wash. Your body caked with filth, and then having to sleep shoulder to shoulder with dozens of similarly unwashed individuals. It's enough to make you wish for a simple bar of soap, or perhaps a very strong clothesline and a fresh breeze. This rampant filth directly contributed to disease. Camps were rife with dysentery, the bloody flux, typhoid fever, smallpox, and various fevers, often spread by contaminated water sources and the sheer proximity of sick men to healthy ones. Imagine a camp where half the men are suffering from violent diarrhea and vomiting, weakening them even before they face the enemy. These illnesses would sweep through armies, killing more men than any pitched battle. The crowded, unsanitary conditions were perfect incubators for epidemics. And then there were the omnipresent pests, especially lice. These tiny parasites would infest hair, clothing, and bedding, causing relentless itching and discomfort. Imagine constantly scratching at your scalp, your body crawling with invisible tormentors, unable to escape them even for a moment. Lice also acted as vectors for diseases like typhus, adding another layer of silent, creeping peril. It's like having a permanent, very itchy, unwanted roommate that also gives you fatal illnesses. These squalid conditions were not just a minor inconvenience. They were a fundamental weakness of medieval armies, often bringing campaigns to a grinding halt as thousands of men succumbed to sickness, highlighting that the true enemy wasn't always on the opposing side. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these conditions is the numerous medieval chronicles and military records that frequently describe outbreaks of disease and high mortality rates in army camps, often attributing greater losses to illness than to direct combat, confirming the devastating impact of poor sanitation. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval soldiers would sometimes try to cleanse their bodies and clothes by intensely smoking themselves over campfires, believing the smoke would drive away lice and bad humors. A rather ineffective and irritating remedy that mostly just made them smell like burnt wood and still have lice. Imagine trying to get rid of parasites by essentially hot smoking yourself like a piece of jerky. It certainly showcases the desperate and unscientific attempts at hygiene. Historians still argue whether the squalid hygiene and rampant disease in medieval armies primarily led to a brutal weeding out of weaker individuals, leaving only the most robust to fight, or if it simply decimated armies indiscriminately and significantly limited the duration and effectiveness of military campaigns. Did it create hardy survivors, or just kill everyone regardless? Your time as a medieval warrior would be steeped in squalid hygiene, battling constant disease, infested with relentless lice, and subjected to an unbearable stench that permeated every miserable moment of your existence. So, your time as a medieval warrior would be steeped in squalid hygiene, battling constant disease, infested with relentless lice, and subjected to an unbearable stench that permeated every miserable moment of your existence. But even if you miraculously avoided the plague and the parasites, your stomach would be perpetually protesting, leading directly to awful food and water rations, sickness, near starvation. Forget abundant feasts or fresh, clean sustenance. A medieval army's diet was a monotonous, often rancid, and frequently dangerous affair, where hunger was a constant companion and thirst a perilous threat. Imagine yourself on a long march, or encamped outside a besieged castle. Your meal wouldn't be a hearty feast, instead. Your diet would be defined by awful food and water, dictated by the harsh realities of medieval logistics and preservation. Your staples would typically be hard bread or hardtack, often dry, stale, and prone to mold, dried pulses like peas or beans, and perhaps some salted meat or fish, which could be incredibly tough and rancid after weeks or months without proper refrigeration. Imagine trying to gnaw on a piece of rock-hard, worm-eaten bread, trying to ignore the greenish tinge on your piece of salted pork, all while washing it down with water that smells faintly of horse and mud. It's like living on a permanent, very unpleasant survival challenge, but there's no prize at the end, just more bad food. The rations were strictly controlled and often meager, especially as campaigns dragged on or supply lines became stretched. Foraging, while common, was dangerous and often yielded little. Near constant hunger was a reality for most soldiers. Imagine trying to maintain your strength and morale on a diet that barely provides enough calories, constantly feeling the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. Particularly during long sieges or winter campaigns, it's enough to make you dream of a single, fresh apple, and then there was the high risk of sickness from your food and water. Food spoilage was rampant due to lack of preservation techniques. Contaminated water, often drawn from rivers downstream from where thousands of men and animals had relieved themselves, was a primary source of dysentery and other waterborne diseases. Remember our hygiene discussion? Imagine the dilemma: drink the questionable water and risk violent illness, or endure agonizing thirst. There was no real good choice in times of extended siege or particularly harsh campaigns. Near starvation could become a terrifying reality. Armies could literally waste away from hunger, their fighting effectiveness plummeting. Soldiers might resort to eating anything they could find: roots, bark, rats, all desperate measures that often led to further illness. Imagine the desperation as your comrades slowly weaken, their faces drawn and gaunt, knowing that starvation is a far more certain killer than any enemy blade. These dreadful provisions were not just uncomfortable, they were a profound strategic weakness, capable of debilitating or even destroying entire armies through hunger and disease. Making the logistics of feeding troops as critical as any battle plan. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these dietary woes is the numerous medieval chronicles and siege accounts detailing the profound impact of starvation and disease on besieged garrisons and besieging armies alike, often leading to surrender or mass casualties without direct combat. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval soldiers, in moments of extreme hunger, would sometimes try to supplement their meager rations by hunting for rats and mice in the camp, roasting them over open fires, despite the risk of disease, showing the desperate lengths to which hunger could drive them. Imagine your dinner consisting of a charred rodent, and you're grateful for it. It certainly puts modern food cravings into perspective. Historians still argue whether the persistently awful food and water on medieval campaigns primarily led to a hardening of the soldiery, forcing them to adapt to extreme deprivation, or if it significantly shortened their effective fighting lifespan and limited the ambition and duration of military ventures. Did it make them resilient, or just sicklier regardless? Your experience as a medieval warrior would be a constant battle with awful food and water, perpetually facing meager rations, debilitating sickness, and the terrifying specter of near starvation. So, your experience as a medieval warrior would be a constant battle with awful food and water, perpetually facing meager rations, debilitating sickness, and the terrifying specter of near starvation. But even if your body somehow held out against hunger and disease, the inevitable reality of battle meant your flesh would still be incredibly vulnerable. Primitive medical care, agonizing wounds, high mortality. Forget sterile operating rooms and advanced diagnostics. Injuries in medieval warfare were common, and the treatments available were rudimentary at best, often causing more pain and leading inevitably to death or grotesque disfigurement. Imagine sustaining a serious injury on the battlefield. Perhaps a glancing blow from an axe has opened your arm, or an arrow has pierced your leg. There would be no paramedics, no quick transport to a modern hospital. Instead, you'd be at the mercy of primitive medical care, often administered by a barber surgeon, a man whose skills might range from rudimentary bone setting to pulling teeth. With little understanding of anatomy or hygiene, it's like getting emergency surgery from your local hairdresser. But with less training and significantly more blood, your agonizing wounds would be treated with methods that today seem horrifying. Without any knowledge of germ theory, wounds were rarely properly cleaned, and instruments were certainly not sterilized. Dirty cloths, unwashed hands, and contaminated salves would be applied, virtually guaranteeing infections. Imagine the searing pain as a cauterizing iron is applied to stop bleeding, or a crude needle and thread stitch up a gaping wound, all without any form of effective anesthesia beyond perhaps a slug of wine or a prayer. The risk of the wound festering, turning gangrenous, and eventually leading to limb loss or death was incredibly high. When an infection progressed, or a limb was shattered beyond repair, the only recourse was often amputations. This horrific procedure would be performed with saws and knives, often blunt, without any effective pain relief. Imagine lying on a makeshift table, fully conscious, as a limb is hacked off. The agony so profound it could induce shock or merciful unconsciousness. If you survived the initial ordeal, the open stump would then be cauterized or bandaged, but the subsequent infection rate was astronomical. Many who survived the battle died from the cure. Even seemingly minor wounds could prove fatal. A simple cut could lead to blood poisoning. A blow to the head, even if not immediately fatal, could result in long-term brain damage, epilepsy, or chronic pain. The combination of intense physical trauma and the complete lack of understanding of infection meant that the high mortality rate from wounds was not just from the initial blow, but from the days and weeks of agonizing decline that followed. This constant threat of disfigurement, agonizing pain, and probable death from even a minor injury cast a long shadow over every medieval warrior's life, making battle not just a clash of arms, but a terrifying lottery of survival against unseen enemies. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this primitive medical care is the archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields and mass graves, which often contain skeletons showing severe, unhealed trauma and evidence of crude, often unsuccessful, surgical interventions like trepanation and amputation. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval barber surgeons would sometimes carry a special wound man diagram, a drawing of a human figure covered in various weapon injuries, which they would consult to determine the best or least terrible treatment for different types of trauma. Imagine your doctor pulling out a gruesome stick figure drawing to figure out how to put you back together. It certainly highlights the limited diagnostic tools of the era. Historians still argue whether the primitive medical care in medieval warfare primarily fostered a brutal resilience in surviving soldiers, forcing them to endure unimaginable pain, or if it simply led to a tragically high number of avoidable deaths and lifelong disabilities, severely limiting the long-term effectiveness of fighting forces. Did it make them hardy, or just kill them slower? Regardless, your body as a medieval warrior was a fragile shell, prone to agonizing wounds that received primitive medical care, and constantly facing the grim reality of high mortality. So, your body as a medieval warrior was a fragile shell, prone to agonizing wounds that received primitive medical care, and constantly facing the grim reality of high mortality. But even if you somehow avoided a fatal injury on the battlefield, the threat of death was omnipresent, not just in pitched battles, constant danger ambushes, skirmishes, sudden death. Forget clear-cut engagements and grand strategies. Medieval warfare was a chaotic, unpredictable affair where peril lurked around every corner, and life could be extinguished in an instant. Imagine your unit on the march, perhaps scouting ahead or simply moving between encampments. You wouldn't be safe just because you weren't on a recognized battlefield. This was a world of constant danger. The landscape itself was unforgiving, but far more threatening were the unseen enemies, always looking for an advantage. It's like being in a very tense, very slow-moving horror film where the monster could jump out from behind any tree. Ambushes were a preferred tactic for smaller, more nimble forces, or for bandits who often blurred the line with soldiers, hidden in forests, along narrow roads, or in misty valleys. Enemy forces could spring upon your unsuspecting group, turning a routine march into a chaotic slaughter. Imagine marching along, perhaps chatting with a comrade, when suddenly arrows rain down from the trees and armed men burst from the undergrowth, turning your ordered column into a desperate scramble for survival. It's enough to make you constantly scan the horizon, even when you're just looking for a good spot to relieve yourself. Beyond full-scale ambushes, there were countless skirmishes, patrols clashing, foraging parties encountering each other. Small detachments meeting by chance. These minor engagements could escalate quickly into vicious, localized fights. Even a seemingly insignificant encounter could lead to serious injury or death. Imagine your small group of foragers stumbling upon an enemy patrol, and suddenly you're locked in a desperate, unglamorous fight for your life over a few chickens. It highlights the pervasive nature of violence, where even foraging for food could be a fatal endeavor, and the grim reality was sudden death in these chaotic, unrecorded clashes. There was no glory, no heroic last stand, often not even a witness. A quick thrust of a spear, a silent arrow from the dark, a blow to the head from an unseen assailant life could be extinguished in a moment. Your body left where it fell, unmourned and unrecorded. Imagine your last thought being a confused flicker of pain, your body slumping to the ground, your existence ending unceremoniously far from any grand battle. This omnipresent, unpredictable nature of danger meant that medieval warfare was not just about the big battles, but the cumulative toll of countless minor encounters where the Grim Reaper collected souls constantly, silently, and often anonymously. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this constant danger is the numerous medieval chronicles detailing countless smaller engagements, raids, and sieges often unglamorous and not considered major battles that caused significant casualties and widespread destruction of the countryside. Confirming that everyday military life was fraught with peril beyond pitched battles, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval soldiers sometimes employed forest walking techniques, moving silently and cautiously through dense woodlands, learning to read subtle signs of enemy presence like disturbed leaves or snapped twigs, essentially turning them into ancient tactical trackers just to survive. Imagine your survival depending on whether you could tell if a squirrel had recently passed by, or if it was a lurking enemy. It certainly shows a highly developed, if paranoid, awareness of their environment. Historians still argue whether the constant, Unpredictable danger of medieval warfare primarily fostered a strong sense of fatalism and reliance on divine providence among soldiers, as their lives were so precarious, or if it honed their individual combat skills and made them incredibly vigilant. Contributing to their survival in a chaotic environment, did it make them resigned to fate, or just more cunning regardless? Your existence as a medieval warrior was a relentless dance with constant danger, facing unexpected ambushes, brutal skirmishes, and the ever-present specter of sudden death. So, your existence as a medieval warrior was a relentless dance with constant danger, facing unexpected ambushes, brutal skirmishes, and the ever-present specter of sudden death. But even more prolonged and agonizing than a quick death on the road was the slow, drawn-out torment of siege warfare starvation, disease, prolonged suffering. Forget decisive battles and glorious charges. Often, medieval warfare devolved into a grim test of endurance, trapping you in a claustrophobic nightmare where time itself became a weapon. Imagine you are part of an army, either besieging a castle or defending one. This wasn't a quick affair. Siege warfare was a slow, deliberate form of conflict, designed to wear down the enemy through attrition and deprivation. For the attackers, it meant months of sitting outside walls, building siege engines, digging tunnels, and engaging in endless, minor skirmishes, all while enduring the elements and the diseases of camp life. Remember the mud and the awful hygiene. It's like being forced to live in a very elaborate, very dangerous construction site. But the only thing you're building is misery for those trapped inside a besieged castle or town. The nightmare was far worse. The primary weapon of a besieging army was starvation. As supplies dwindled, food would become scarce and then non-existent. Imagine the agonizing hunger, the desperate rationing of every crumb. Watching your comrades grow weaker and gaunter each day, people would resort to eating anything: rats, leather, even each other in the most extreme cases. The mental toll of this slow descent into hunger, knowing salvation might never come, was immense. Compounding the hunger was disease, confined within walls, often with contaminated water sources and overflowing latrines. Illness would spread rapidly through the cramped population. Dysentery, typhoid, and various fevers. Remember that rampant disease from our hygiene discussion would decimate the defenders, weakening them further and filling the confined space with the stench of sickness and death. Imagine trying to defend a wall or care for your family while half the population is writhing in the throes of a violent illness. It's enough to make you wish for a quick death by enemy sword rather than a slow, agonizing demise from disease or hunger. This was a period of prolonged suffering. Sieges could last for months, even years. Hope would dwindle, morale would plummet, and the daily reality would be one of unremitting misery. If the castle eventually fell, the fate of the defenders was often brutal, with massacres common, especially if they had resisted fiercely. Imagine living through weeks of desperate hunger and sickness, only for your home to finally be breached, leading to a bloody, chaotic end. Siege warfare, more than any other form of medieval conflict, stripped away any semblance of glory, revealing the raw, inhumane face of war as a test of suffering and endurance for both sides, with immense human cost. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this prolonged suffering is the numerous medieval chronicles and archaeological findings from famous sieges, such as the Siege of Acre during the Crusades or the Siege of Orléans during the Hundred Years' War, which detail widespread starvation, disease, and the extreme lengths to which both attackers and defenders were driven. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that besieging armies would sometimes launch diseased animal carcasses, or even human ones, over castle walls using trebuchets. A crude but terrifying form of early biological warfare designed to spread illness and psychological terror among the defenders. Imagine a diseased cow landing in your courtyard, rotting and spreading contagion. It certainly made sieges even more disgusting and deadly. Historians still argue whether the extreme hardships of siege warfare primarily acted as a deterrent, making belligerents hesitant to engage in such costly and prolonged conflicts, or if it simply demonstrated the immense resilience and strategic importance of fortifications, leading to even more desperate and brutal siege tactics. Did it prevent war, or just make it worse regardless? Your involvement in medieval warfare often meant enduring the agonizing reality of siege warfare, characterized by the slow torment of starvation, the rampant spread of disease, and the unrelenting burden of prolonged suffering. So, your involvement in medieval warfare often meant enduring the agonizing reality of siege warfare, characterized by the slow torment of starvation, the rampant spread of disease, and the unrelenting burden of prolonged suffering. But even when the gates finally fell, or the pitched battle began, the horrors were far from over. They simply shifted to the visceral, up-close nightmare of brutal hand-to-hand combat maiming, disfigurement, no mercy. Forget clean sword duels and graceful maneuvers. Medieval fighting was a chaotic, bloody, and intensely personal struggle for survival where the aim was often to incapacitate, not just to defeat. Imagine yourself in the thick of a medieval battle line. The air would be thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and iron. The sounds would be deafening: the clash of steel, the screams of men and horses, the thud of blows. This was brutal hand-to-hand combat, a desperate struggle where every swing of an axe, every thrust of a spear, was aimed at a soft spot in armor, a vulnerable limb, or directly at a face. It's like being in the world's most violent, least organized mosh pit, where everyone has very sharp objects and is trying to hit you with them. The weapons themselves were designed for devastating impact. Swords, axes, maces, and polearms were heavy, blunt instruments, wielded to crush bone, shatter shields, and tear through flesh. This often resulted in horrific maiming. Limbs could be severed or broken, faces smashed beyond recognition, and skulls cracked open. Imagine the sickening crunch of bone, the spray of blood, and the raw, guttural screams of men being irrevocably broken by the blunt force of a medieval weapon. It's enough to make you wince just thinking about it, even if you weren't immediately killed. The likelihood of disfigurement was incredibly high. A glancing blow to the face could take out an eye, shatter a jaw, or leave you with a permanent, hideous scar. Limbs might be mangled, hands crippled, leaving survivors with lifelong disabilities that made earning a living or simply living a normal life incredibly difficult. Imagine surviving the battle, only to face a future missing an arm, or with a face so ruined that children scream at the sight of you. This wasn't about looking heroic. It was about sheer, agonizing survival. And in this chaos, there was often no mercy, especially for common soldiers, or when one side was completely routing. Surrendering often didn't guarantee safety. Capturing high-ranking nobles might offer ransom, but for the rank and file, it was often easier and quicker for the victors to simply cut down any remaining resistance. Imagine begging for your life, only for a blade to descend, ending your plea. This created a profound sense of desperation, where fighting to the last breath might genuinely be your only option. This extreme brutality of close-quarters combat was a visceral, horrifying reality that defined the individual experience of medieval warfare. Leaving few untouched by its physical and psychological scars, one mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this brutal hand-to-hand combat is the archaeological findings of mass graves from medieval battlefields, such as Towton or Visby, where skeletons show extensive paramortem trauma from a wide variety of medieval weapons, indicative of incredibly violent and personal engagements. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval warriors would reportedly deliberately smash or cut off the noses and ears of fallen enemies as a grim form of trophy, or to identify them as enemies should they miraculously survive. Adding another layer of gruesome disfigurement to the aftermath of battle, imagine thinking to yourself, well, I just fought for my life. Now time to collect some ears. It certainly speaks to the dehumanizing nature of the conflict. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality and potential for disfigurement in medieval hand-to-hand combat primarily served as a psychological deterrent, making soldiers more hesitant to engage in direct confrontation, or if it simply normalized extreme violence and fostered a culture of ruthlessness among combatants. Did it make them wary, or just more savage regardless? Your grim reality as a medieval warrior involved participating in brutal hand-to-hand combat, leading to rampant maiming, permanent disfigurement, and the horrifying absence of no mercy. So, your grim reality as a medieval warrior involved participating in brutal hand-to-hand combat, leading to rampant maiming, permanent disfigurement, and the horrifying absence of no mercy. But even if you somehow survived the immediate carnage of battle, the indelible marks of such horrors would be left not just on your body, but deeply etched into your mind. A psychological toll, PTSD, nightmares, desensitization. Forget valiant glory and celebratory returns. The relentless exposure to medieval warfare's atrocities bred a profound mental anguish, leaving many soldiers shattered, haunted, and irrevocably changed. Imagine standing amidst the aftermath of a bloody battle. The sights, sounds, and smells, the screams of the dying, the metallic tang of blood, the piles of mangled bodies would be etched into your memory. This exposure to extreme trauma frequently resulted in a severe psychological toll, while not recognized with modern terms. Conditions akin to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, were undoubtedly rampant. Soldiers would suffer from flashbacks, extreme anxiety, hypervigilance, and an inability to fully escape the horrors they had witnessed and inflicted. Imagine trying to find peace in a quiet village, only for the sudden sound of a blacksmith's hammer to send you spiraling back into the chaos of battle. Your heart pounding, your hands trembling. It's like living with a permanent, very loud, and very violent mental soundtrack. Sleep, when it came, would offer little respite. Plagued by terrifying nightmares, the gruesome images of combat, the faces of those you killed or watched die, the desperate pleas for mercy, these would replay endlessly in your mind, robbing you of restorative rest. Imagine waking up in a cold sweat, your heart pounding, unable to distinguish the terror of your dream from the lingering fear of the battlefield. This constant disturbance would further erode your mental state, leading to chronic exhaustion and irritability. To cope with the unimaginable horrors, many warriors would experience a profound desensitization to violence and suffering. What once might have shocked or sickened them would become normalized. The capacity for empathy could diminish, making it easier to inflict cruelty or witness atrocities without feeling. Imagine seeing a village burned and its inhabitants slaughtered, and feeling little more than a weary acceptance. Your emotions dulled by repeated exposure to such acts. This desensitization was a grim survival mechanism, but it also chipped away at their humanity, leaving them emotionally scarred and alienated from those who hadn't shared their experiences. This immense psychological toll meant that even survivors of medieval warfare were often deeply wounded men, struggling with invisible scars that made reintegration into civilian life incredibly challenging and sometimes impossible. The internal war raged long after the external one had ended. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this psychological toll is the anecdotal evidence from medieval chronicles and letters describing symptoms consistent with modern PTSD in returning soldiers or knights, such as fits of melancholia, extreme violence outside of combat, or difficulty sleeping after prolonged campaigns. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval veterans, struggling with these internal demons, would reportedly turn to extreme religious devotion or pilgrimages, seeking spiritual absolution and solace from the burdens of their past deeds, hoping divine intervention could heal the wounds that no physical remedy could touch. Imagine a hardened knight, after years of brutal combat, dedicating his life to solitary prayer in a monastery, desperately seeking peace. It certainly speaks to the profound spiritual and psychological distress they faced. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of medieval warfare primarily created a more ruthless and effective fighting force by desensitizing them to fear and suffering, or if it significantly undermined long-term societal stability by returning a large population of traumatized and potentially violent individuals to civilian life. Did it make them better fighters? Or just worse citizens regardless? Your mind as a medieval warrior would be a battlefield unto itself, grappling with pervasive psychological toll, haunted by terrifying nightmares, and experiencing a grim desensitization to the horrifying realities of conflict. So, your mind as a medieval warrior would be a battlefield unto itself, grappling with pervasive psychological toll, haunted by terrifying nightmares, and experiencing a grim desensitization to the horrifying realities of conflict, but beyond the personal suffering, the rules of engagement, or rather, the lack thereof, added another layer of terror: no quarter massacres, civilian atrocities, no prisoners. Forget honorable surrenders and Geneva Conventions. Medieval warfare was often a ruthless, total conflict where mercy was rare, and the concept of a civilian was often fluid, making every encounter a potential fight to the death. Imagine your army, after a hard-fought victory, sweeping through the enemy's camp or a conquered town. This was often the time of no quarter. The phrase "give no quarter" meant that no prisoners would be taken. All resistance, or even just the act of being an enemy combatant, would be met with death. For the common soldier, this was a terrifying reality. If you were captured, your chances of being ransomed or even held for exchange were slim to none. Imagine surrendering your sword, only for the victor's blade to descend without hesitation, ending your life. It's like playing a board game where if you land on the wrong space, you instantly lose, and the other players get to laugh about it. This lack of mercy often led to outright massacres of defeated enemy soldiers. When an army routed or a stronghold was finally breached, the victors, often exhausted, bloodthirsty, and seeking revenge, would cut down fleeing or surrendering combatants without distinction. Imagine witnessing piles of dead bodies, not just from the battle, but from the brutal aftermath, as men who had laid down their arms were still butchered. This was not always strategic. Sometimes it was simply the result of uncontrolled rage and the dehumanization of the enemy, and the horrors extended beyond the battlefield to innocent populations, leading to widespread civilian atrocities. Towns and villages in the path of an army, whether allied or enemy, were often subjected to plunder, rape, and slaughter. Famine and disease, remember those charming companions, would follow in the wake of armies? Imagine seeing your home pillaged, your family attacked, or your community destroyed, simply because you were in the way of a marching army. The concept of collateral damage was simply damage. There was no protected status for non-combatants in the modern sense. Their lives and property were often fair game for desperate or vengeful soldiers. The brutal reality of no prisoners meant that the individual soldier often had only two choices: fight to the death, or attempt to flee and hide. This fueled the ferocity of combat. As there was often no safe option for surrender, it made every encounter a life or death struggle, devoid of the chivalric ideals often associated with the era. This ruthless aspect of medieval warfare highlights its truly terrifying nature, where the distinction between soldier and civilian, combatant and non-combatant, often blurred in the heat of destruction and the pursuit of conquest or revenge. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this no-quarter policy is the numerous medieval chronicles and legal codes that describe the widespread practice of killing surrendered garrisons or entire civilian populations during the sack of cities, often as a deliberate policy to demoralize the enemy or punish resistance. For example, the sack of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval commanders would reportedly order their musicians to play deafeningly loud and aggressive tunes during a general rout or pursuit, not just for morale, but specifically to drown out the cries for mercy from fleeing enemies, ensuring their soldiers would continue the slaughter unimpeded. Imagine the trumpets blaring as you're trying to ask for your life. It certainly highlights the deliberate efforts to remove all semblance of humanity from the battlefield. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of no quarter and civilian atrocities in medieval warfare primarily stemmed from a pragmatic necessity, aiming to break enemy morale and secure decisive victories quickly, or if it reflected a deeper cultural acceptance of extreme violence and a lack of humanitarian restraint compared to later periods. Did it lead to efficiency or just unbridled savagery regardless? Your grim experience in medieval warfare would be forever marked by the ruthless policy of no quarter. Witnessing horrifying massacres, enduring widespread civilian atrocities, and facing the terrifying reality of no prisoners taken. So, your grim experience in medieval warfare would be forever marked by the ruthless policy of no quarter. Witnessing horrifying massacres, enduring widespread civilian atrocities, and facing the terrifying reality of no prisoners taken. But even for those who survived the immediate brutality of conflict, the long-term consequences of warfare could be just as devastating, leading to financial ruin, lost lands, debt, destitute aftermath. Forget victorious returns and prosperous futures, war in the Middle Ages. Even for the winners, often left a trail of economic devastation that could cripple families and communities for generations. Imagine returning home after years of campaigning, perhaps with a few scars and a lifetime of nightmares. You wouldn't necessarily find prosperity awaiting you. This was the harsh reality of financial ruin. Even if your side won, the economic impact on the common soldier, and often even on the nobility, was catastrophic. It's like signing up for a war and realizing the prize for victory is a lifetime of trying to pay off your hospital bills and repair your bombed-out house. With no insurance, for many, especially commoners whose lives revolved around agriculture. Protracted warfare meant lost lands. Fields would lie fallow due to disrupted labor. Crops would be burned by marching armies, both friendly and enemy, and livestock would be seized or killed. If your farm was in a war-torn region, returning to find it utterly devastated, your livelihood destroyed, was a common occurrence. Imagine coming back to find your family's fields overgrown with weeds, your barn burned to ashes, and your only source of income gone. It's enough to make you wish you had stayed on the battlefield. At least there was a quick end, even for knights and minor nobles. War was incredibly expensive. Equipping yourself, maintaining horses, and raising retinues cost vast sums. This often led to crippling debt. Nobles might mortgage their lands, borrow heavily from merchants or the church, or even sell off valuable heirlooms to fund their participation if a campaign dragged on, or if they were captured and had to pay a ransom. The financial burden could be immense, sometimes leading to the permanent loss of their estates. Imagine fighting bravely for your lord, only to return home and find that your ancestral lands have been forfeited to a moneylender because of the cost of your armor. The overall result was a destitute aftermath for vast swaths of the population. Trade routes were disrupted, markets collapsed, and populations dwindled due to death and displacement. The economic engine of society, agriculture, was shattered for returning soldiers, even if they survived. Finding work or rebuilding their lives in a shattered economy was incredibly difficult. Many veterans became vagrants, beggars, or even turned to banditry, unable to reintegrate into a society that had no place for them or their skills outside of war. This economic devastation highlights that medieval warfare was not just a clash of arms, but a profound societal disruption that could impoverish entire regions, making the victory feel hollow for countless individuals. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this financial ruin is the historical records of widespread economic depression and famine following prolonged conflicts like the Hundred Years' War, where agricultural lands lay waste, trade declined, and populations struggled with poverty for decades, impacting all levels of society. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval lords, in a desperate attempt to recoup the immense costs of war, would sometimes resort to debasing their coinage, reducing the silver or gold content, leading to rampant inflation and further economic instability for everyone else. A subtle form of financial warfare against their own populace. Imagine fighting a war for your king, only for the money he pays you with to suddenly be worth half as much. It certainly added insult to injury for the common soldier. Historians still argue whether the financial ruin caused by medieval warfare primarily stimulated innovation in economic practices and taxation, as rulers sought new ways to fund their conflicts, or if it simply entrenched feudal systems and perpetual poverty for the majority of the population by destroying productive capacity. Did it lead to new economic ideas, or just more misery? Regardless, your involvement in medieval warfare, even if you survived, meant facing severe financial ruin, often grappling with lost lands, crippling debt, and a bleak, destitute aftermath. So, your involvement in medieval warfare, even if you survived, meant facing severe financial ruin, often grappling with lost lands, crippling debt, and a bleak, destitute aftermath. But beyond the economic desolation, the very fabric of society and your personal connections would be torn apart, leading to social dislocation, families destroyed, orphaned, homelessness. Forget community stability and the comforting embrace of kin. Medieval warfare was a colossal engine of displacement and fragmentation, severing the ties that bound people together and leaving countless lives shattered. Imagine trying to find your way back to a sense of normalcy after years of war. It wouldn't be easy, because your entire world might be irrevocably altered due to social dislocation. War didn't just affect soldiers, it ripped through the civilian population, leaving widespread chaos in its wake. It's like a giant, very destructive game of Jenga, but instead of wooden blocks, it's people's lives and communities that are being pulled apart. One of the most profound impacts was on families destroyed. Men went off to fight and never returned, leaving widows and children. Women and children left behind might face starvation, violence, or forced displacement. Imagine a family, once whole and functioning, now fractured by death and absence. The children left without a father, the wife without a husband, struggling to survive in a ravaged landscape. This wasn't just a few isolated cases, it was a societal epidemic. The sheer scale of casualties and displacement meant countless children were left orphaned, their parents killed in battle, or succumbed to disease or starvation. Remember those charming companions? These children often had no one to care for them. They might be forced into begging, petty crime, or servitude, their childhood stolen, their futures bleak. Imagine being a child, wandering the burned-out remnants of your village, completely alone, with no hope or direction. It's a truly heartbreaking consequence of conflict, and for vast numbers of people. War meant outright homelessness. Villages burned to the ground, towns sacked and left in ruins. Farms made unlivable, these acts of destruction forced entire populations to abandon their homes and seek refuge elsewhere. They became refugees in their own land, desperately searching for safety and sustenance. Imagine having to gather your few remaining possessions and simply walk away from everything you've ever known, with no destination, no resources, and no idea where your next meal will come from. This pervasive displacement transformed medieval landscapes into scenes of utter desolation, filled with wandering, desperate souls. This deep and widespread social dislocation highlights that medieval warfare was not just a military event, but a catastrophic humanitarian crisis that dismantled communities and left generations reeling from its profound and lasting damage. The social fabric was shredded, making rebuilding a monumental, often impossible, task. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this social dislocation is the detailed census records and historical accounts following major medieval conflicts like the Black Death or various interstate wars, which show dramatic population declines in affected regions, significant movements of people, and the breakdown of established social structures. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval monasteries and religious orders, overwhelmed by the sheer number of orphans and displaced persons, would sometimes establish specific hospitality houses, or almshouses designed solely to offer temporary shelter and food to war refugees. Though their resources were often quickly stretched beyond capacity, imagine a group of monks trying to feed an entire starving village, all because of a distant war. It certainly speaks to the desperate measures taken by the few institutions trying to cope with the immense human suffering. Historians still argue whether the social dislocation caused by medieval warfare primarily led to the strengthening of feudal bonds, as people sought protection from powerful lords, or if it significantly weakened central authority and fostered a more fluid, chaotic social environment where traditional hierarchies broke down. Did it reinforce power, or just create anarchy regardless? Your life in medieval society, especially during times of conflict, would be fraught with profound social dislocation. Seeing families destroyed, countless individuals orphaned, and widespread homelessness as the grim legacy of relentless warfare. So, your life in medieval society, especially during times of conflict, would be fraught with profound social dislocation, seeing families destroyed, countless individuals orphaned, and widespread homelessness as the grim legacy of relentless warfare. But even if you avoided being a direct victim of these societal collapses, the very act of reaching the battlefield was often a grueling and dangerous ordeal, leading to perilous journeys, long marches, banditry, exhaustion. Forget comfortable transportation or well-maintained roads. Moving an army in the Middle Ages was a monumental logistical nightmare. Fraught with hazards that could decimate forces before a single battle, imagine being ordered to join your lord's army, assembling from across the kingdom. You wouldn't be hopping on a bus or train. Instead, you'd embark on perilous journeys, often covering vast distances on foot. These were long marches, often over unpaved, muddy, or dusty tracks, through forests, over rivers, and across mountains. You'd carry your own gear, or sometimes march alongside overloaded wagons, your feet aching, your muscles protesting, day in and day out. Imagine trudging for weeks, your simple boots offering little protection, your rations meager. Remember that awful food, and the constant uncertainty of what lay ahead. It's like embarking on a never-ending, forced marathon where the finish line might be a violent death. Along these routes, the threat of banditry was ever-present. Disbanded soldiers, desperate peasants, or simply opportunistic criminals would prey on vulnerable travelers and smaller detachments. Even within your own army, individual soldiers might turn to looting or preying on local populations. Imagine hearing whispers of brigands ahead, knowing that your small party could be ambushed at any moment, not by enemy soldiers, but by desperate, lawless men seeking plunder. It's enough to make you constantly scan the tree line, even when you're just trying to find a private spot for a natural break. And the sheer physical toll of these journeys led to profound exhaustion. Lack of proper sleep, remember that. Constant physical exertion, poor nutrition, and exposure to the elements would wear down even the hardiest soldiers. Many would fall sick or simply collapse from fatigue along the way, becoming burdens or stragglers who were easily picked off. Imagine trying to stay awake and alert while on guard duty after marching all day. Your body screaming for rest, knowing that your life depends on your vigilance. This wasn't just physical weariness, it was a deep, bone-weary fatigue that permeated every aspect of a soldier's existence, even before the fighting began. This combination of arduous travel, constant threat from outlaws, and debilitating fatigue meant that armies often arrived at their destination significantly weakened, their numbers reduced, and their morale already low. The journey itself was a filtering process, sometimes as deadly as any battle. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these perilous journeys is the detailed accounts in medieval chronicles of the incredibly slow pace of army movements, often only covering a few miles a day, and the significant losses suffered by armies during marches due to disease, desertion, and exhaustion. Not just combat, for instance. The logistical challenges and attrition faced by crusader armies marching across vast distances. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval armies, when passing through particularly treacherous or bandit-infested areas, would reportedly employ scouts whose primary job was to go ahead and clear the path by either fighting off or intimidating any potential ambushes. Essentially acting as very early and very dangerous advanced security teams. Imagine your job being to literally walk into a potential ambush first. It certainly highlights the extreme dangers of medieval travel. Historians still argue whether the perilous nature of medieval journeys primarily limited the scope and duration of military campaigns, making long-distance warfare incredibly difficult, or if it inadvertently fostered a unique discipline and resilience among the soldiers who successfully endured such hardships. Did it restrict war, or just forge tougher warriors regardless? Your path to medieval battle was a grim odyssey, fraught with perilous journeys, encompassing seemingly long marches, constant threats of banditry, and profound physical exhaustion. So, your path to medieval battle was a grim odyssey, fraught with perilous journeys, encompassing seemingly long marches, constant threats of banditry, and profound physical exhaustion. But even when you finally reached the battlefield, you'd be burdened by another fundamental source of misery: equipment. Burdens: heavy armor, uncomfortable gear, expense. Forget lightweight, ergonomic combat attire. Medieval warriors were encased in cumbersome, restrictive, and often agonizingly heavy protection, making every movement a Herculean effort. Imagine preparing for battle, or even just for a march. You wouldn't simply throw on a light uniform. Instead, you'd begin the arduous process of donning your equipment burdens for a knight or a heavily armored soldier. This meant layers of padding, chainmail, and plate armor. A full suit of plate armor could weigh anywhere from 50 to 80 pounds. Distributed over your body, designed for protection, not comfort or agility. Imagine trying to run, jump, or even just stand for hours in what feels like a lead blanket that also chafes and pinches. It's like trying to fight a war while carrying a very angry, very heavy small child on your back. Except the child is made of steel. This heavy armor wasn't just weighty, it was incredibly restrictive. Movement was limited, peripheral vision often impaired by helmets, and the sheer effort required for every step and swing would quickly lead to fatigue. Imagine trying to breathe deeply in a helmet that offers poor ventilation, or swinging a heavy sword when your shoulders are already burning from the weight of your mail coif. It's enough to make you long for a simple pair of track shorts and a light t-shirt. Beyond the armor, all your uncomfortable gear contributed to the misery. You'd carry your weapon, sword, dagger, possibly a shield or a polearm, all adding weight. Water skins, a meager food pouch, and other necessities would be strapped to you or carried by a squire if you were lucky. Footwear was often ill-fitting and led to blisters and sores. Especially on long marches, remember those. Imagine the constant chafing of rough wool against your skin, the pressure points where armor digs in, and the perpetual discomfort of being bundled in layers of heavy, unyielding material. And then there was the immense expense. Good armor and weapons were incredibly costly, often representing a lord's or knight's entire fortune. Losing or damaging your gear was a catastrophic financial setback. For common soldiers, even their simpler equipment represented a significant personal investment or was provided by their lord, but still came with its own burdens of maintenance and wear. Imagine dedicating a significant portion of your income, or a lifetime of service, just to acquire the heavy, uncomfortable equipment that might still get you killed. It certainly put a damper on any thoughts of upgrading to the premium model. These equipment burdens made every aspect of a warrior's life more challenging, turning daily existence and combat itself into a profound test of physical endurance. Even before factoring in the enemy, one mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these burdens is the physical evidence from excavated medieval armories and archaeological finds of armor components, confirming their significant weight and the sheer complexity of their construction. Designed for maximum protection, not wearer comfort. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval knights, when suffering from extreme heat exhaustion while wearing their heavy armor, would sometimes have their squires or attendants pour cold water directly into their helmets as a crude way to cool them down, often leading to a sudden, chilling shock but brief relief. Imagine your only cooling system being a bucket of icy water dumped on your head. It certainly highlights the desperate measures taken to manage the discomfort. Historians still argue whether the extreme equipment burdens of medieval warfare primarily led to slower-paced, more deliberate battles, due to the limited mobility of armored combatants, or if it instead fostered innovative strategies focused on exploiting the vulnerabilities and fatigue caused by such heavy gear. Did it slow down war, or just make it smarter? Regardless, your existence as a medieval warrior was defined by constant equipment burdens, from your heavy armor to all your uncomfortable gear, all acquired at immense expense, adding another layer of misery to your already perilous life. So, your existence as a medieval warrior was defined by constant equipment burdens, from your heavy armor to all your uncomfortable gear, all acquired at immense expense, adding another layer of misery to your already perilous life. But even after enduring the brutal training, the squalid conditions, the terrible food, the primitive medicine, the constant dangers, the horrors of siege and combat, the psychological torment, the lack of mercy, the financial ruin, the social dislocation, and the arduous journeys, one final, overarching truth would always loom: unpredictable outcomes, betrayal, fickle fate, sudden defeat. Forget grand plans and assured victories. Medieval warfare was a chaotic, unpredictable dance where the slightest misstep or twist of fortune could instantly unravel everything, turning triumph into catastrophic ruin. Imagine standing on the eve of battle, or even in the midst of one, believing victory is within grasp. This sense of certainty was a dangerous illusion due to unpredictable outcomes. Medieval warfare, despite its elaborate strategies, was profoundly susceptible to chance, human error, and sheer bad luck. It's like playing a high-stakes game of chess where the pieces occasionally decide to just wander off, or your opponent suddenly conjures a dragon. One of the most devastating, unpredictable outcomes was betrayal. Alliances were often fluid, loyalty tenuous. A supposedly allied lord might switch sides in the middle of a battle. A subordinate commander might deliberately disobey orders, or a disgruntled soldier might open a gate to the enemy. Imagine fighting fiercely for your lord, only to look over and see a supposedly friendly banner now fighting against you, turning your flank into a deadly trap. This kind of sudden, unexpected treachery could instantly collapse an army, turning a winning position into a desperate rout. Beyond human perfidy, there was simply fickle fate. The weather could change suddenly, a driving rain turning a field into a quagmire, or a thick fog obscuring vital movements. A key leader might fall ill or be struck down by a stray arrow. Remember how common injuries were. A critical piece of equipment might fail at the worst possible moment. Imagine your archers, perfectly positioned, only for a sudden gust of wind to render their arrows useless. Or your most charismatic general collapsing from dysentery just before the charge. These small, unpredictable twists of fortune could have monumental consequences, deciding the fate of entire battles and campaigns, and the ultimate unpredictable outcome was sudden defeat. Even the most carefully laid plans could unravel in an instant. A single successful flanking maneuver, a sudden charge breaking a weak point, or a moment of panic spreading through the ranks could turn an orderly line into a fleeing mob, leading to catastrophic losses. Imagine the terrifying transition from confident advance to desperate, every man for himself flight, knowing that your life depends on outrunning a pursuing enemy that has no mercy. Remember that. This swift, brutal reversal was a constant fear, as it often meant not just losing the battle, but losing your life or freedom. This inherent unpredictability meant that every medieval campaign was a desperate gamble, where courage and skill were only part of the equation, and the whims of fortune, or the perfidy of others, could always deal a devastating, unexpected blow. One mainstream historical fact, that powerfully illustrates these unpredictable outcomes is the numerous medieval battles documented in chronicles where seemingly smaller or disadvantaged forces achieved decisive victories due to unexpected tactical blunders. Weather shifts or last-minute betrayals, such as the Battle of Agincourt where muddy conditions severely hampered French heavy cavalry. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval commanders, in an attempt to combat fickle fate, would reportedly employ astrologers or soothsayers to predict auspicious dates for battle or movements, hoping to gain an edge by aligning themselves with cosmic forces. Despite the often contradictory results, imagine your general delaying a major offensive because his astrologer told him the stars weren't aligned. It certainly highlights the deep-seated uncertainty and reliance on any perceived advantage. Historians still argue whether the high degree of unpredictable outcomes in medieval warfare primarily hindered the development of sophisticated military theory, by making grand strategies often irrelevant, or if it instead fostered a unique emphasis on adaptability, individual initiative, and resilience at the tactical level. Did it prevent strategy, or just make it more fluid regardless? Your existence as a medieval warrior was a constant, terrifying dance with unpredictable outcomes, where betrayal was a real threat. Fickle fate could strike at any moment, and sudden defeat was always a catastrophic possibility. Now, let the clang of steel fade from your ears. The mud and stench of the battlefield recede, and the chilling cries of the wounded gently dissipate. The heavy armor lifts from your shoulders, the gnawing hunger in your stomach quiets, and the terrifying fear of ambush melts away into a blurring memory. There's no more threat of sudden death, no more concern about treacherous allies, and no more struggle against brutal conditions. Just the soft hum of your fan, the gentle warmth of your blanket, and the profound quiet of your room. You can release the imagined burdens of that horrifying medieval warrior's life, the constant pain, the psychological scars, and the terrifying realities of a world so profoundly different from our own. That grim, fascinating, yet undeniably harsh ancient world of combatants belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.